It's time to accelerate. Hey friends, this is Andy. Welcome to episode 564 of Accelerate, the sales podcast of record. Joining me on the show today is Eddie Yoon. Eddie is the founder of EddieWouldGrow, which is a growth think tank and advisory firm, and author of a really interesting book called Superconsumers. And in this conversation, we're going to dig into the value of superconsumers, really from a business-to-business standpoint. So these are superconsumers of your product and your service. And these are very different than your heavy users. I mean, these are the customers, superconsumers, so the customers that can drive your growth and really account for a large percentage of your profit. So, for instance, if you're in a recurring revenue business like a SaaS company, you definitely want to tune in and listen to this one. So if you'd like to see a summary notes for this episode, go to andypaul.com/574. As always, provide a timestamp breakdown of this and all conversations on Accelerate. Now, friends, we all hit a sales slowdown from time to time. Oftentimes, sellers default to the notion that the solution to a slowdown is adding more structure and more process. But it doesn't always work. And sometimes you need to try some new ideas to break out of the doldrums and sell up to your potential. So if you're looking for new ideas about how to amp up and accelerate your sales, then you need to read this new report I put together. It's based on the specific recommendations of more than 300 leading entrepreneurs, sales leaders, seasoned business executives that I've personally interviewed on this program. And I've compiled their practical tactics and strategies into a step-by-step guide that you can use to accelerate your sales today. So don't wait. Go to accelerate.fm/accelerate to get your free copy of my report today. Also, I want to give you a heads up on a couple changes. First, for those who follow me on Twitter or want to follow me on Twitter, I've changed my Twitter handle. It was at 0 Time Selling. It's now at Real Andy Paul. And also, I had been hinting the last few weeks that we're going to make some changes to our program schedule. And we're doing that beginning next week. And really in response to listener comments, because most frequent comments we get about the show is, as I said, one, people love the show, but two, just too many episodes to keep up with. And so we want to make sure that we're not overloading people, we're not contributing to sort of the noise pollution around sales, if you will. So starting next Monday, we're going to go to 3 episodes a week. It'll be Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Friday will still be everybody's favorite episode, Conversations with Bridget on Frontline Fridays. So Monday, Wednesday, Friday, make sure you check that out. And then finally, before we get to my conversation with Eddie, I want to remind you that we want to hear your questions about sales and sales management. So send what are the challenges you're really facing? And if you send your question to me at andy@andypaul.com, each week I'll choose one question from those submitted the previous week to answer on my Friday conversation with Bridget. That's on Frontline Fridays. The winner, the person who submitted the question that we answer on the air, will win a free half-hour coaching call with me. That's a $250 value. So don't delay. Submit your question today. You can send it again to me at andy@andypaul.com, or even easier, if you want to send us an audio message, go to andypaul.com. On the homepage, lower right-hand corner is red button. Click the red button. You can leave us an audio message. And we look forward to hearing from you shortly. All right, so here we go. Let's jump into it with Eddie Yoon. Eddie, welcome to Accelerate.
Thanks, Andy. Great to be here.
Oh, my pleasure. So you're joining us from where today?
I am in Chicago. This is where I live and been based here for the last 20-some-odd years. And thankfully not on a plane today.
Yeah. Well, especially summertime in Chicago with O'Hare can be a little dicey.
To your point, we just had a bad storm last night, and I have some branches in our backyard, and I was like, I am so glad I didn't have to travel yesterday, which I almost did. So, knock on wood there.
Yeah, I've lost track counting the number of hours I've circled over O'Hare trying to land.
Well, apologies to that. So.
Well, that's okay. No, I tell people my scariest airplane story ever was O'Hare in a storm where we were circling, waiting for a storm to pass over the runway, I guess.
Yeah.
And they said they apparently cleared them. So they start accelerate, going down into the glide path, going down. And you can see from the side of the plane I'm on, a storm coming on the left-hand side, storm coming from left to right, right over the runway, coming right. And it's like, who's going to get there first?
Oh, my goodness.
Apparently, they decided at the last minute the storm was going to get there first, and they couldn't land. So no more than, seemed like a couple hundred feet off the ground, they just turned like like they went on the wing, went straight up and down, right? Just,
Wow.
it just came around.
Wow.
I thought we were going into the ground, right? But I've never seen such an extreme turn with a commercial airplane. And everybody thought we were landing until suddenly we weren't, and we were sort of at 90 degrees to where we were before. It was like, that got the heartbeat going.
Nothing like playing chicken with weather, right?
Yeah. Well, on the other hand, I'm glad they went around, but
absolutely
could have done it maybe a little less extreme. But anyway, so welcome to the show. Now, I've got a standard question to ask all my guests to start with, and so in your mind, and I know sales isn't necessarily your top field, but in your mind, what's the single biggest challenge facing sales reps today?
Yeah, I think that it's managing your emotions. I always say, for me at least, with that part of my job, but also, if I have clients that are trying to accelerate their own sales, is that, you never deserve all the credit that you do get when things are going well, and you never deserve all the blame that you get when things are going badly, right? And, it's a very much, here's what I've noticed is that when I'm in a situation where I really want something to happen, and if I overwant it too much, then I start to behave in ways that I probably, if I were to step out of my body and look at myself, I'm like, you know what? I don't like that side of me. And the people that I'm interacting with, I think they can tell, right? That there's a sense of something feels odd. It feels a little, there's an air of desperation. Maybe that, this person's interest might be elevating to the top ahead of my own. And, that's when things go off the rails with it. And so, this notion of, I think of two things for the individual and for running a business, that every salesperson, you have to manage your emotions so that you are, have the right ratio of inputs and outputs, right? So it's too tempting as a salesperson to measure just the outputs. Did I close? What are my numbers looking like? But the truth of the matter is, I think anyone in the sales business of some sort, and I think everyone is you're really more like a farmer, right? And you should be planting seeds, watering them, and just being patient. And that's the input part, which is really all that you can control. And if you can manage your emotions so that you have the discipline and, focus on the inputs and are thankful for the outputs and are patient when they're not coming, then that's always going to be a better outcome than overstressing or over celebrating something that, so many other things had to happen for it to happen anyway.
Well, and that's sort of the eternal conundrum that exists in sales, is especially these days with more inside sales models that are driven by metrics that say, hey, how many outreaches you're making today, that sort of are almost antithetical to what you talked about, because they are all about achieving certain, things as opposed to an outcome that's something both you and the buyer want. Right. Yeah, I wrote something about that just recently, and there's actually research says that people actually, like in sales, if you want something too much, your odds of getting it actually go down.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I completely believe that, and I think for me, it's often the way to handle it is to kind of flip it on its head, and as a sales rep, to use this same technique with the people that they're selling to say, when you make your decision, make sure you're making it not just on the performance of the business, but the health of your business. And the example that I gave is, Netflix just came out with their most recent earnings report, and the stock shot up because, they added 5.2 million more subscribers. And that's what Wall Street really cares about, is did the subscriber count go up? And I always say is, that's great. And I've written about Netflix quite a bit, but it's this idea of the subscriber count is really an output. It's a measure of the performance of the business, which is important. But the other metric that people should pay attention to is minutes per subscriber. Like how engaged are their viewers, on the show? Right. And that number hasn't gotten much play, but and it's a little not completely transparent. But my calculations estimate that that's been flat versus where it was the year before, and that might be cause for concern. But you think about that as like, well, they've added downloadable content, and so minutes will go up, and they're adding more and more shows, and so it should be okay in the long run. But I think this notion of make sure that you're making decisions not just on the performance, but the health of the business. And that I find is a good reminder. It's helpful to my clients, but also helpful reminder for me of, hey, man, got to balance those inputs and outputs too.
I like it. Great. Well, let's talk about the book you've written. It's called Superconsumers, A Simple, Speedy, and Sustainable Path to Superior Growth. And written the book itself, admittedly more from sort of a B2C type perspective, but we're going to get into a B2B spin on it as well. But I thought we'd start just by sort of defining some terms for listeners. One is, okay, so what's a super consumer?
Sure.
And how's it? I think people confuse those, as you talk about in the book, between heavy users and super consumers. So once you define it, then tell what the difference is between a heavy user and a super consumer.
Yeah. So a super consumer I define as somebody who spends a lot and cares a lot, right? And the heavy buyer moniker that you were describing, Andy, is usually it's just someone who just spends a lot. Now, that's important, but you don't really know why they're spending, right? It could be somebody who buys a lot of bread. Maybe they like bread. Maybe they have a bunch of teenagers in their house, and that's what it's required. And they don't actually like bread themselves.
Well, we know they're not gluten-free if that's the case.
They're not gluten-free, absolutely right. And I think this combination of whenever somebody is buying a lot, and again, it applies from bread to enterprise software to cloud services or whatnot. Mm-hmm. But you want somebody who cares and is kind of geeking out about the category too, right? And so I think that's the number one difference is because for some people, your listeners are like, this sounds like the Pareto principle, the 80-20 rule. And it is that, but it is adding on to it a level of emotion that I think is distinctive beyond just behavioral metrics of I spend a lot. And then the second thing that I noticed is that it's not so much, you don't count if you spend a lot or care a lot about a particular brand. You need to care about the category writ large, right? So somebody who is a huge Tesla fan, you might be a Tesla, heavy user or avid follower or fan, but somebody who's really into electric cars, that's what I would really think about as a super consumer in a much more helpful way, because a lot of companies, what I find is that there's a little too much navel gazing about their own brands and products. And when you talk too much to people who like you, they're not going to be honest with you because maybe they don't want to hurt your feelings, or they haven't tried every other service provider out there, so they can't tell you objectively what you're good at and what you're not good at. And so adding that emotion, adding the wider frame of reference, that's what a super consumer is. And if you get that, then it's a much more powerful way of looking at the world.
So the emotional attachment is then not necessarily to the brand.
Correct. It has to be to the category writ large. And okay. I think that distinction is really important there.
So let's take out, because you give some brand examples in the book. So you give an example with Gatorade, for instance. So yes. Talk about that and tell us how it's about the category writ large, as you said, versus the brand itself.
Yeah. So certainly there are people who are, Gatorade heavy users, and
sure.
Now you might think of the image that comes to mind of Michael Jordan or pro athletes and stuff. But what's interesting is that the people for whom that are actually some of the heaviest users of Gatorade are some of the day labor and construction crew crowd. And one of the interesting things, if you go back to the financial crisis in 2008, was because that nugget and nuance was missed, that when the economy started to go down and housing and construction went down with it, Gatorade sales fell off with it too. And so people didn't really realize that was interconnected that way because they were just looking at it from just a straight up perception of, you might have somebody who is a weekend warrior who plays basketball occasionally and hopefully doesn't sprain their ankle, couch potato type person. Right. And they drink Gatorade, on the weekends.
Sure.
Whereas a construction worker, that's their livelihood and their job. They've probably gotten up pretty early and they're done at like 10 or 11. And Gatorade is a perfectly acceptable thing to buy and consume there. And it's a totally different venue than what they advertise with it, but it is a different mindset of somebody who buys a lot but also cares about it from a different angle, right? So the weekend warrior might be someone who cares about it but doesn't buy a lot, and that's not as insightful as it could be. Somebody who buys a lot just because they're doing hard labor, but they don't care about it, that's also an important nuance. What you're really looking for is somebody who's doing both. I drink it during the week because my job requires it, and I'm playing football or soccer or baseball, whatever, on the weekends, and because that's part of my passion within that person will give you far greater insights about what's going on, what else they might be using. Is it not only Powerade or other refreshment beverages that they're doing to kind of get to the same benefit? And some of the best insights come from, I'm sweaty to death and I'm in a 7-Eleven buying this thing, and I consume it before I even pay for it because I'm so thirsty. And, that insight comes back to, well, maybe we should make the opening of the mouth, the lid bigger to enable that guzzling dynamic that's there. So I think this notion of everybody has preconceptions about what different categories and brands, like who these supers might be. And more often than not, I find that I am surprised and others are surprised by who they actually are and why they use the category.
Well, but that's the why is a critical point, though, because I'm thinking to your example
Yes.
about construction workers, because one of the points you make in the book is that super consumers in these categories and some of the brands seem to tap into some aspirations, right?
Absolutely.
So how does that work? Let's say taking the construction worker example with Gatorade, with consumers, super consumers, and this aspirational aspect of it.
Well, so it's your point of, I always say that your typical consumer, generally when they make buying decisions, it's usually on one of three benefits. There's rational, emotional, and aspirational benefits, as you were describing. Mm-hmm. And most people just kind of stay at the rational level. Like, I have a need, I am thirsty, and I need something, and usually the other rational need is price. And the risk of kind of overemphasizing average people or just anyone off the street is that's what they're going to tell you is make it cheaper. That'll make me happy, which is not super helpful, right? Whereas to your point, someone who is, working construction during the week and then, also doing athletic stuff on the weekends, there's an emotional component to it of like, it's a different type of image that I'm trying to project when I'm consuming it, maybe after work and on the weekends. And I think to your point about the aspirational part of it is that maybe it is I'm doing this job so that I can actually graduate to something else that I really want to do. Maybe I want to start my own business so that I have the flexibility to be that kind of, because the Michael Jordan image is always hanging out there. Sure. But it may not be that it's necessarily I'm going to be, a 6-time NBA champion and whatnot. But it might be that I become my own mogul, right? I'm not just a player; I'm a business as well, right? I have my own. I set my own path, and I create my own brands, and that aspiration, I think, becomes as important as being like Mike, which is kind of how they built the brand around it from a mass appeal standpoint. But that kind of notion of, Michael Jordan as a player versus Michael Jordan as a successful business person is a radically different idea that I think actually may have wider appeal to their audience there. Got
it. So you talk about the value of super consumers being that is sort of a superior growth strategy because they can account for certain large fraction of sales, even compared to heavy users, but they tend not to be price buyers.
Correct. So I think to your point, all of those things that you said are true. They're not price sensitive. They buy a lot. And the most important thing is that I think almost every super consumer that I've met, you're not kind of born that way. You evolve to become a super consumer, right? So, and if that's the case, then what it suggests to me is that other people can become like them too, which is the real power of the idea, is that, yes, there are a small set of people who drive a lion's share of the category economics, and you certainly want your fair share, if not more of them. But they figured out something that allows them to use the category in different ways that actually, if other people realized those life hacks, as it were, they might consume the category at a higher rate too. And that, if the top 10%, maybe they drive anywhere from 30 to 70% of sales. what I often find is that there's about 20% of consumers in a category that are these potential super consumers. They're people who, they share similar motivations like the supers do, but they only account for about 20 to 15% of sales. So they're not spending more than their fair share, right? And if you actually got them a little bit higher, to say 20% drove 30% of sales or 20% drove 40% of sales, then you'd actually be growing the category by 10 to 20%. And that's my ingoing premise is that every category has super consumers. And if that's the case, then there are potential super consumers. And no matter what business that you're in, I believe that it could grow 10 to 20%, which is, I think, a very different strategy for growth than, hey, Andy, the category, let's say you and I compete, and it's a zero-sum game. The category ain't getting any bigger. Mm-hmm. And therefore, the only way that I can grow is to take from you. Right? And that creates a whole different strategy, tactical execution that I actually think is not helpful for the long-term health of your business or my business. Like, you might win one year and maybe I win the next year, but we all kind of are worse off for it in the long run versus if we collectively kind of say, you know what, we think we can actually make the pie bigger. And usually what I find there is that 1% of brands capture 80% of the category growth upside. And so ironically, if you were to make the category bigger for both of us, I would benefit, but you would benefit disproportionately. Sure. So.
Yeah. Well, I mean, a perfect example of that, Apple back in the early days of PC business when IBM entered the market. I mean, Apple sales took off in a way they weren't growing prior to IBM entering the market.
Great example. Yeah. Yeah.
So the super consumers, though, really are the fans. So if the people are going to be on social media or people are going to be, subscribing to your Snapchat channel as a brand, so on, more likely to be super consumers, I'd imagine.
It's a great point because I always say supers, they leave digital breadcrumbs everywhere because people always say, well, that sounds interesting. How do I find them? They sound, like a needle in a haystack. And what I always say is that, for some of us might be in really sexy categories, like, I don't know, your wine or your favorite spirits or cars or whatever. But, for those of us who maybe are in less kind of, cocktail party chatter type of stuff, if anyone is on social media or online posting anything about your category that's not particularly sexy, it's to your point, Andy, they're probably into the category, right? Mm-hmm. If they, and how people spend their time is as telling as how they spend their money. So if they've taken the time to sign up for a newsletter or an email distribution, probably a super. If they've taken any sort of effort to, open up their privacy, open up their time or their money and their wallet, then that's a telltale sign. The other thing that I always say is that they're kind of sitting in plain sight in your data, right? And that what super consumers are, what they represent are those spiky parts of the blip on your data, like an EKG. And anywhere where you see kind of unusual spikes, they're probably there. And they're probably stuff that most people have dismissed. And the word in business that I hate the most is average, and kind of hey, my average share is this, my average growth rate is that. And because it smooths out all the rich kind of nooks and crannies in your data that are actually revealing where these supers are.
Right.
And, I think this whole notion of they're actually far easier to find and therefore easier to engage and learn from. And therefore growth is a lot quicker for you there.
Well, yeah. I mean, you just highlighted sort of the big problems with big data is that, A, it's big. People want to smooth it, as you say, and they don't know how to read it.
I think that latter part is exactly that. Because and it's this bizarre kind of disposition that we have for some reason to avoid anomalies, right? And I think a lot of what I've discovered is that super consumers are easy to dismiss as weirdos and kind of oddities and the like. But if you actually, have empathy, treat them with respect, and try to figure out why do you behave in the way that you do, there's a logical story behind it. And I think to your point, it just makes you kind of highlight, like, aberrant data, anomalies, spikiness, things that are usually smoothed over. That's where all the good stuff is. And that, to your point, big data is hard enough to use anyway. Mm-hmm. If you could actually focus it on the weird spikes, seemingly, that's actually where you'll get the most juice out of it.
So you said your wife is a super consumer of scissors. What about you?
Yes. I'm a super consumer of T-shirts from Hawaii. So I'm born and raised there. So I would love to be like you and split my time in San Diego too. But I'm most of the time in Chicago, and we go back home. Yeah, it is. Yeah, I don't feel so bad. I get back to Hawaii to see my folks. At least once a year, maybe sometimes more. And so when I show up, I'm sure the local T-shirt shop is like, here that guy comes again, because he's going to pick up 6 to 8 to 10 T-shirts.
Wow. Now, wait. Now, which island are you from?
I grew up on Oahu.
Oahu. So what T-shirts are you buying?
I buy, usually there's a local motion T-shirt store that I go to. They have that brand, and they have the Hawaiian style brands that are there, and so it's close to where my parents are. I like the designs. I like I know my size and the like. So
all right, I'll check it out.
That's the one I default to.
Yeah, I'm good. See, I my third place would be Hawaii. So I go 3 times, sometimes more a year myself. So yeah. I'm gonna be there shortly, so I have to get the name of that store.
Check it out. The crazy T-shirt brands, that's the telltale sign that you're not a local. So don't. I mean, not to be a snob, don't get that one. But like the Local Motion, the Hawaiian Island Creations, there's a couple of them that are like, okay, that you might be from there and the like. But for me, they represent a chance to kind of medicate my homesickness. And so the part that is kind of funny about this, though, is that I wear T-shirts and shorts now in the summertime, but I wear them in the wintertime, which are not particularly practical. So I end up cranking up the electricity, which makes my wife really angry. And so I have to, she's like, layer. I'm like, I don't know how to layer. She's like, you've been here for 20 years. Why can't you layer? I'm like, well, and so I end up having to make her, because I'm an early bird, I make her coffee with her Keurig in her favorite mug with just the right amount of milk. I leave it by the bedside for her to wake up to, because she's not an early morning person, because that allows me to kind of earn my way out of the doghouse for future things that I know I'm going to screw up.
It's like all these things that just come from a Hawaiian T-shirt.
Well, I mean, that's the kind of the joy of this whole thing is I discovered this in the big data when I was writing my book of, if you're a super consumer of one category, you're a super of 9 others, some of which are logical and obvious, and some of which are not. And so you would not think that a Hawaiian T-shirt super would be an electricity super, would be a coffee super. But, in the story of my life, they make complete sense, and you can earn a chuckle. And that's the thing that I always tell people is the good stuff isn't in the data. The good stuff is in the story. And not everybody is from Hawaii and maybe want Hawaiian T-shirts, but this idea of homesickness and the idea of compensating behaviors for that's actually a much bigger idea. And that's the nugget when you can build a business or an innovation platform around the broader idea that has truth from maybe something that seems a little of a niche platform, but can appeal to a much wider audience. That's when you have a winner, because it's born out of a super consumer origin story, but has broad application to bring in other people as well too.
So let's talk about this we talked about at the beginning, as we're going to talk about this in a B2B sort of context. Is this as applicable in a B2B space? I mean, let's take a typical SaaS company in Silicon Valley. How does it apply?
Yeah. So I think it absolutely does. And so let's say you have a SaaS company, as you were describing, in the Valley, and they're trying to figure out and actually I think to your point, software as a service is a great example of, you have a central procurement person, but, to some degree, a large degree, your revenues are a function of how much adoption you get, right? And how many licenses and seats that you get. And this is where I get to this notion of, you see it on the B2C side where social media and whatnot has amplified individual voices to the point where, it's a little bit interesting where so much more power has shifted to individual consumers who can just absolutely destroy a brand if they treat them poorly with it. And that the same dynamic can happen too in terms of when you're trying to drive adoption. The good old days of the CIO and the CEO all agree that we're going to do some sort of ERP transformation, and come hell or high water, you're going to use it and like it, right? I mean, that's totally different. And what you need to do are folks who let's say you're trying to put a new payroll service in or a new sales tracking metric software service into a new enterprise. You want to figure out for who are the super consumers from a time standpoint, right? So in a B2B, end buyer, end user situation, you just got to measure it slightly differently. So the end user may not be spending their own money, but what they are spending is their time, their productivity and the results and their own political capital within it. And if you're trying to take a SaaS offering, what you really be better off doing is figuring out what set of stakeholders within the organization have the greatest unmet need for this. They love SaaS services, right? They love the next generation innovations that are coming out, and they're always trying new things that are out there, right? Even if the company's using one thing, they're at conferences or they're like, hey, buddy, what are you using? Maybe that might be better, right? And so they're the toughest audience to get across, but when you win them over, they will do your work for you, right? You won't need the whole notion of word of mouth as an important marketing and sales vehicle is as critical on the B2B side as it is on the B2C side. And I think that this notion of let your supers do your evangelism for you is the really key part of it. And I think it's not really an either or, like you can't just go after supers and your job is done, but it's a sequencing thing, right? You find the supers who are really into, SaaS writ large. You figure out what needs that they have and you tailor to that. And then you figure out who's the next tranche of people that'll get you critical mass. And that's how you get, the people who are the stick in the muds will never convert to save them for the end. Right.
Right.
And it's just and at least from a sales rep perspective, it feels good to have some momentum. Right. So why wouldn't you start with a super and then the potentials and then let that momentum carry the day for everybody else?
Yeah, and I think there's some characteristics that the supers have, at least in a B2B space, that differentiate them from heavy users, right? Because I know a lot of times in the customer success side of business, they're focusing on sort of the heavy users as opposed to maybe somebody who's found something different to do with the product, right? That it's not something, not an application use that you've part of your use case that you put forward to the customer, but it's like, oh, well, that's interesting. Now that's where we could grow the number of seats or number of people that are, licenses we sold to them. Or, hey, help us penetrate a new account altogether. Something just out of the different. And I think there's too much focus I see on the heavy users versus the people that are perhaps using it uniquely.
Well, and I think that's the key. You hit the nail on the head, Andy, is that what you're really looking for are use cases that you hadn't thought of beforehand, right? And so one of the examples that I wrote about in HBR was the notion of Velveeta as a brand, which it's clearly has so much correlation with SaaS as it out there in Silicon Valley, right? Yeah. But the Velveeta classic use case is cheese dip for a Super Bowl. That happens once a year. The super consumers were using it as a Trojan horse to get their kids to eat more vegetables, right? I can't get my kid to eat broccoli, but if I dump Velveeta on it, and because it's the best melting cheese, it gets into every nook and cranny, they will then eat that. And then when you start to market the problem, not being you don't have enough processed cheese in your life, which is no one's going to raise their hand for that, but if you market the problem as, hey, anyone, would you like your kids to eat more veggies? A lot more hands raised for that. And I think that alternative use case that you would never thought of that a super can help you crack the code on, that's really where the opportunity is. Because I think back to some work that I did for smart compressors and valves for heating, ventilation, and air conditioning company and stuff, right? They're selling these components into retailers, right? So Walmart and Target and Whole Foods. And, the original use case that they had thought of, because it's, hey, it can monitor electricity usage. And if you want to save money, this is the way to go. And, you had a couple of people who are very cost conscious that kind of bid on that. But the ironic part that they hadn't anticipated were two new use cases that they had seen that super consumers of this category had revealed to them, right? So there's one type of super consumer, and think of a retailer that grew by acquisition, right? So you don't have a standard store format. You're buying somebody else's technology, and the guy that's running real estate is pulling out his hair or her hair, right? Because I just inherited somebody else's schematics, and my people are calling me and saying this compressor was down. And I'm like, it's not my fault. I didn't install the darn thing, and what do I do about it? And literally, this guy was telling the client that I was serving, will you, for the love of God, will you please sell me in this way, right? Which is, I don't want to fix these stupid components. I want to replace them with my stuff. I can't justify it with the way that you're selling it to my CFO because you're not selling it the right way. I need you to redo your proposal so that it reflects total cost of ownership, right? So that, hey, CFO, I know this thing is only 3 years old, and I know it's cheaper cash flow wise to repair it, but trust me,
over 10 years, right? It pays
over
off.
10 years, yeah, it's going to pay off in the long run, and we'll, blah 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 blah. And so, literally, you had a super consumer trying to convince the sales rep to increase the order, right, so that it would make their lives easier. And I think that empathy and influence is really, really important. And then the other flip side that they got to was, getting to really high-end retailers. So again, what's interesting is that the lower end and the more mass a retailer is, usually don't find people who are like, I'm so excited to be a mass merchant and stuff, right? But if you're like a Whole Foods or you're Ralph Lauren, you're like, hey, I'm really proud to be offering the foods that I have or the special high-end clothing that I have, and the environment and the experience of the store really matters. And those people were like, no. I don't want the smart valves and compressors and the wireless sensors to tell me when my electricity usage is going up or down. I want to know for the fresh pressed juice that I just made if I'm going to kill somebody because the temperature set is off, right? Like, I don't want a food safety risk.
Right.
But I'm going to serve more raw foods, and that's on trend. Or, you know what? I have this really high-end deli case. You got to let me know when the humidity is off, so the point where I don't want foggy windows in my case. It's going to look bad, right?
It looks bad all the time, right?
And so, and it's this whole notion of like, for the love of God, make my life easier, or, create the most premium experience, because to your point about Apple, we have the highest sales per square foot of any retailer that's out there. Right. And I don't want it to look bad. And that's what I want your technology to do for me. And so, like, I think this notion of just in any kind of a B2B setting, because the sales force originates from the people who made it, and because the people who make it, you think about the world through the lens of, well, it does these things, and I anticipated these, two use cases. Supers on the B2B side will help you imagine the next 4 to 5 that you hadn't thought of. And I think, to your point, Andy, identify if that use case is really powerful. I have a whole new set of customers I never thought of beforehand.
Exactly. Yeah, perfect. All right, well, Eddie, unfortunately, we've run out of time, but great conversation, and we'll have to have you back, and we'll talk more about this. So tell folks how they can connect with you and learn more about you.
Oh, absolutely. You can reach me on my website, www.EddieWouldGrow.net, so EddieWouldGrow.net, or you can find me at Twitter at EddieWouldGrow.
Okay. Excellent. Well, thanks. And friends, thank you for joining us today. Make sure you come back again tomorrow. Listen to another great episode of Accelerate. Until then, if you get a chance, appreciate it. Go to iTunes or wherever you listen to this podcast, subscribe, leave a review. Really want to hear back from you about what we can do to make this a more valuable investment of your time. So thanks again for joining me. Until next time, this is Andy Paul. Good selling, everyone.